Good day, everybody. This is Chris with the Ancient Scholar. I hope this video finds you all doing well. I'm sorry it's been a while since I've posted a video. Things have been very interesting at work, to say the least. But I actually have some time off, and I'm driving up to my ancestral grounds, my ancestral home of northern Wyoming. So I've got a lot of time ahead of me where I'm not going to be doing much but driving. And so I thought what I would do is do a few videos on my way up, kind of pass the time and to provide some content for my channel. So this is going to be the first of hopefully a few videos. We'll see. In this specific video, what I want to talk about is a very esoteric situation, or very esoteric concept. That is a concept of high pressure nervous syndrome, or the contemporary term is high pressure neurological syndrome, also known as HPNS. So let's roll into this. This is fascinating. Still lots of unanswered questions surrounding this concept. So high pressure neurological syndrome, I suppose, starts the intuition for it, the understanding of it starts way back in the 1920s and 1930s, when we were developing the prototype technologies that allowed us to operate in the aquatic environment. These are sometimes referred to as aqua lungs, and we now refer to this technology as a scuba, or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, also referred to as an open circuit system. And essentially what it is you have a tank of compressed gas, and then you have some regulation equipment that regulates the pressure. You know, you have high pressure, and then you regulate it down to low pressure that's more appropriate, and then you have essentially a valve device that you breathe from. You inhale, and then when you exhale, you blow that gas out into the water that you're in. This is also referred to as an open circuit system, or open circuit diving. There are other paradigms, or we call closed circuit or rebreather paradigms, and I won't really talk about that in any substantial detail today. So in the 1920s and 30s, we were developing the prototype technologies, and we were experimenting. And essentially what we would do is we would just take air in the atmosphere and we would pressurize it into a tank. And so you were breathing pressurized air, which is, roughly speaking, about 80% nitrogen molecules, and roughly speaking 20% oxygen. It's actually more like 20.9% oxygen and 79 and some change percent nitrogen, and then a little less than 1% other gases like carbon dioxide, helium, and various other molecules that are pretty rare, at least in Earth's atmosphere. And so what they found out is when they would dive deep, and most like recreational diving tends to occur probably 60 feet or less of seawater, so fairly shallow. And I should also say that approximately every 10 meters or every 33 feet of water you dive into, and this varies a little bit between saltwater and freshwater, but approximately every 33 feet you go down, every 10 meters, you can add an entire atmosphere of pressure. And so the concept of atmosphere is actually important to understand. And so when you are standing on the surface of the Earth at sea level under what we call standard temperature pressure conditions, so STP conditions at sea level, you're under what's called 1 atmosphere of pressure. So all the gas, right? All the gas in the atmosphere is gravitationally attracted to the Earth, right? And so it gets held down, and that produces a pressure. Pressure is just force over an area, all right? And at sea level, under standard temperature pressure conditions, the pressure that all of these molecules of nitrogen, of oxygen, and so on exert on your body is about 760 millimeters of mercury, right? And that's the entire, from sea level all the way up to, space, which depends on how you want to define that. If you define that as the Kármán line, or so many hundreds of thousands of feet above sea level, wherever you want to define space, but essentially from, hundreds of thousands of feet above all the way down to sea level, that entire column of air, right, is pushing down on you at sea level with a pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, or 14.7 pounds per square inch. And then what happens is, every 10 meters of water you go under, that water exerts a pressure, and a column of water about 33 feet deep or 10 meters deep, it exerts another atmosphere. So if you go 10 meters underwater, you're actually under 2 atmospheres of pressure, the atmosphere at sea level and then another atmosphere. So every 33 feet of water that you go under, 33, 66, 99, you're adding another atmosphere of pressure, or a bar. Some people refer to this as a bar. So if you're under like 2 bars of pressure, you would be under, and you're underwater, you would be approximately 33 feet underwater, right? For 1 bar would be sea level, and then the second bar would be that 10 meters that you're underwater. And so as these divers were going underwater, the deeper they would go, they were experiencing neurological effects, and these were very intoxicating effects. So think of like drinking alcohol and becoming inebriated, and developing issues with problem solving, planning, risk-taking behavior, and eventually incapacitation, just complete incapacitation the deeper you went. And they figured out that this was actually due to the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and nitrogen under pressure exerts a narcotic-like effect on the central nervous system. This is also referred to as nitrogen narcosis, or some people will say they're getting narked, or some people refer to this as rapture of the deep, right? So the more nitrogen that gets dissolved in your blood under these higher pressures, for reasons that aren't well understood, causes a narcotic-like effect on the central nervous system. There are some hypotheses out there, and there has been some research, but it does seem like under pressure the nitrogen interacts perhaps, or disrupts proteins in the cell membrane of neurons. And these proteins you think of them as different receptors, GABA receptors, glutamate receptors, or NMDA receptors, serotonin receptors, dopamine receptors, and so on and so forth. And that alters their function, maybe changes their shape, maybe even alters the phospholipid bilayer of the cell wall, and that alteration causes this narcotic-like effect, and it gets worse the deeper you go, the more pressure of nitrogen. It is possibly a mechanism that is not dissimilar to general anesthesia, right? When you go and you have a surgery and you inhale anesthetic gases like sevoflurane, isoflurane, halothane, etc. It is hypothesized that these anesthetic gases, they're not nitrogen, but they are hydrocarbons that are typically halogenated, and they're not at high pressures, but those molecules also seem to interact with various receptors, and maybe even the cell membrane itself, and causes ultimately it can cause a loss of consciousness and loss of nociception, or the inability to perceive pain and react to stimuli. Causes anesthesia. So it could be a similar mechanism. We're not entirely sure, but we do know that the nitrogen exerts these narcotic-like effects under pressure. And so they had to figure out, if possible, a way to negate or ameliorate those narcotic effects. And what they realized is that if you were to replace the nitrogen with helium, as we knew that helium is what we call an inert gas. Helium is not chemically reactive for the most part because it has 2 electrons in its inner shell, its ground state shell. It's full. It is what we say has met its duet or octet rule. And so it's not chemically interactive, and so it would make sense. You would think, oh, it's probably not going to interact with the cell membrane, at least chemically, and so it's safe to breathe as long as there's enough oxygen mixed in with it. It's safe to breathe at sea level. Let's try it under pressure, and they did, and they realized, oh, this is a good way of negating the impact of nitrogen narcosis. And so people that would dive deeper would breathe this gas mixture called heliox. It's a mixture of helium and oxygen. So they'd replace the nitrogen with helium. Well, interestingly enough, what they found out is people that would dive generally below about 150 meters or so would, on heliox, would start to develop some interesting neurological signs and symptoms, not quite like nitrogen narcosis, where you have an impairment in your mental status, but they would have some neuromuscular irritability. They develop tremors, and as you might imagine, if you're deep down below 150 meters or so, and you're having to do work, you're having to partake in certain tasks, and you're developing these tremors, that could be problematic. And then the deeper you go, the more pressure you go, the more neurological effects. Some people can even develop seizures, and the tremors could get really bad. And they also realized that the faster you went down, the more likely you were to develop these tremors. And these were originally called helium tremors. And so they realized that if you could descend slower, you could offset the impact of these. But the problem with that is a lot of divers like to descend rapidly. And the reason being is if you're diving, particularly fairly deep, there's another problem. We won't really get into it in this particular video, but essentially what happens is when you put a gas under pressure, more of that gas can actually dissolve in your body. That's actually called Henry's law. It's a gas law. Essentially, the pressure of a dissolved gas inside of the body is proportional to the pressure around the body. So the deeper you go, the more gas can dissolve in your body. And what happens is if you rise suddenly and you suddenly decrease that pressure, that gas that has been dissolved in your body can then will no longer be soluble, and it will start coming out of your tissues, and it will form little bubbles, and those bubbles can go into your joints and under your skin and into your brain and your lungs and your heart, your kidneys, and this creates a painful and sometimes life-threatening situation known as the bends, or decompression sickness. And so you have to, depending on how long you're down there, what kinds of gases you're breathing, you have to ascend slowly and stop at certain points to allow you to off-gas that gas. Essentially, that gas comes out of your blood and you can breathe it off, so it isn't caught creating bubbles and collecting in critical areas of the body. That's called decompression. You take decompression stops. Well, if you can get down quickly, do what you need to do, that minimizes the amount of time that gas is dissolving and moving into the various compartments of your body, and so you will have less time for decompression. So that is not ideal to tell people, hey, if you just go down slowly, you can negate some of the effects of these helium tremors. And so we had to figure out some other solution. Well, these helium tremors are now what we call high pressure neurological syndrome, or HPNS. And so what they realized is if you add a little bit of a gas that has narcotic-like effects under pressure, you can offset the neurological symptoms a little bit, or quite a bit in some cases. And so what they started doing was then they started adding a little bit of nitrogen back into the mixture. And a new gas mixture known as trimix was developed, which is primarily a mixture of three gases: oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. And a little bit of that nitrogen added back in, that little bit of that narcotic effect, would kind of offset this neurological irritability that we were seeing with just the helium alone. There have been experiments with other gases like hydrogen, adding hydrogen in, and it is successful to varying degrees with negating some of the impacts of high pressure neurological syndrome. The problem with hydrogen is it's explosive when mixed with certain pressures of oxygen. Now, the deeper you go under really high pressures, you can actually mix it with very small percentages of oxygen, like 3-4%. And I think, where they were experimenting with this hydrogen well under 1,000 feet of seawater, the amount of oxygen it needed to be less than 4% at those pressures, and it wasn't actually explosive. The hydrogen wasn't actually explosive in that situation. So it was relatively safe, but it's certainly not something that's generally safe and scalable. So really the primary gas mixtures that we're using now are if you're recreationally diving in shallower waters, 60 feet and under, say, it's relatively safe just to breathe compressed air, we call nitrox. And then when you penetrate those deeper depths, you're going to have to use these other gas mixtures, heliox, and then even trimix. So that's what high pressure neurological syndrome is. It's really related to the impact of helium under pressure. And again, we don't know exactly why this happens or what the mechanism is, but we do know that we can ameliorate it somewhat by adding nitrogen back into the gas mixture. And helium also has some other good and bad properties. It's good in that helium is it's the second smallest and the second least dense atom. And the interesting thing about breathing gas under pressure is the deeper you dive, the gas is under a lot more pressure, and so the gas mixture is much more dense, and it's a little more difficult to move that gas into and out of your pulmonary system, and so that does increase the work of breathing. And helium is a gas that is very light, has a very low density, and so that does help with work of breathing. It's not as difficult to move into and out of the pulmonary system as other gas mixtures. So that is a good effect. But another problem that we run into with helium is it has very poor thermal qualities. And so what happens is you tend to lose a lot of heat when you're breathing helium. And so there is an increased risk of hypothermia when breathing gas mixtures that have helium in them. And so like commercial divers will actually have to wear special diving suits that circulate warm water through that suit to keep them warm, and they have to live in a habitat that the temperature is higher than you would normally want, because you tend to lose heat a lot faster than with other gas mixtures, so hypothermia is a problem. And then the gas, because helium is less dense, the way that it moves in and out can be a little faster, and the sounds that are produced when your vocal cords vibrate tend to be pitched up higher, and that can make communicating very difficult. And so there's descrambling technology that has been developed to down pitch people's voices to help facilitate improved communication. So you can see it's a really complex interplay of a lot of things going on when you talk about these deeper dives and using these special gas mixtures. And hopefully now you understand, if you didn't before, to understand a little better why different gas mixtures are needed and when they're needed. And from a medical perspective, if you are treating somebody who has been in this environment, you're treating them for some dive-related problem, these are part of the questions that you need to ask them, right? What kind of dive plan did they have, right? How long? What was their bottom time? What did their decompression look like? What kinds of gas mixtures were they breathing, right? And this can help you anticipate or think about certain problems that may have happened during the dive that may play a role in the problem that the patient is currently experiencing. So that's just kind of a basic overview of the high pressure neurological syndrome, or HPNS. Hopefully you found it kind of interesting, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. All right, everyone, take care, be safe, have fun doing whatever you may be doing today.